New York City, 1906. The rooftop of Madison Square Garden glows under electric light, the new symbol of America's power. Below, the city hums like a machine, millions of lives stacked on top of each other, reaching for the sky. But at the very top of it all, among the laughter and champagne, one of the most famous men in America is about to die. Stanford White, age 52, sits at a table near the orchestra, calm and smiling. He is the architect who built the skyline, the mansions of Fifth Avenue, the clubs of the elite, and this very rooftop where New York's richest now dine above their own reflection. He is charm made flesh, tall, red-haired, dressed in white linen, a man who built dreams out of limestone. Every senator, every banker, every debutante knows his name. He is the Gilded Age's decorator-in-chief. But tonight, someone else knows it too. Across the terrace, a young millionaire named Harry Kendall Thaw stands trembling. He's 26, wealthy, and burning with humiliation. His wife, Evelyn Nesbit, the most photographed woman in America, once belonged to White. Not in gossip, but in fact. White had met her when she was 16. She had been an artist's model, a dancer, a child turned muse, and he had turned her into a secret. Thaw never forgot it. He married her anyway, then let the knowledge fester. He called White the Beast. He dreamed of retribution dressed as honor. And tonight, in front of hundreds of New York's finest, he's ready to stage it. It happens fast. The orchestra starts a song. Guests laugh. And then, 3 gunshots. White collapses in his chair, blood spreading across his cream vest. The guests freeze, believing it's part of the performance. But Thaw stands over him, arm shaking, voice rising. He ruined my wife. The music stops. The Gilded Age does too. Reporters would call it the crime of the century. Not because of the death itself, but because of what it exposed. Behind the marble and manners of America's ruling class, there was lust, hypocrisy, and rot. By midnight, the rooftop was empty except for White's body and the scent of gunpowder. The man who built America's monuments had become its first tabloid martyr. And down in the street below, people began whispering the same question that would haunt the trial for years. Who was really guilty, the man who pulled the trigger, or the world that made him need to? To understand why Stanford White died, you have to understand the city he helped build, not the one shown in postcards, but the one hidden inside velvet curtains and locked rooms 6 floors above the street. New York in 1906 was a paradox in brick and gaslight. The richest men in America lived within blocks of starvation. Moral reformers held prayer meetings across the street from brothels dripping in pearls. The newspapers called it the age of elegance. The streets called it something else, the age of purchase. Stanford White moved through both worlds effortlessly. By day, he was a titan of taste, the architect of the Washington Square Arch, the New York Public Library's reading room, the Fifth Avenue mansions where industrial kings toasted their fortunes. He carried the Gilded Age on his drafting table, shaping it window by window, spire by spire. But by night, he was a collector of beauty in its most vulnerable form. He designed secret rooms lined with velvet, mirrors, and cushions, not for clients, but for himself. His private suite on 24th Street featured a red silk swing suspended from the ceiling, gilt-trimmed and built just high enough that a girl, always young, always delicate, would laugh as she flew through the air, skirts blooming like fabric flowers. In those rooms, the future wasn't being drafted. It was being devoured. White was not a monster in the eyes of his peers. He was their reflection, refined, charming, indulgent. The newspapers celebrated him. Artists adored him. Young women were flattered to be noticed by him, before they learned what attention cost. Evelyn Nesbit was one of them. She was just 16 when she met him. A child. A dreamer. Beautiful in the way that made people forget her age. White treated her like a muse, expensive dinners, silk gowns, portraits commissioned by famous painters. And then, the night that would follow her for the rest of her life. She later recalled the room. The wine. The blurred edges of consciousness. The moment she woke up under a velvet coverlet, unable to move. When White told her, "Now you belong to me." She was too young to understand what she'd lost. too afraid to tell anyone who would believe her. Years passed. Reputation hardened into myth. Evelyn became famous. Photographed. Desired. But never free. And when Harry Thaw, the unstable young millionaire, fell in love with her, he did so completely. Violently. Possessively. As if saving her from White would purify him. He asked her for the truth. She gave it. Not knowing that every word would turn into a bullet. White's world was fragile by design, glamorous, elevated, and sealed from consequence. But the Gilded Age had a fatal condition: it ignored what it couldn't afford to acknowledge. So when Harry Thaw pulled his gun atop Madison Square Garden, the shot didn't just kill a man. It exposed a system. A world that protected predators because they were charming. A society that worshipped beauty, then blamed women for inspiring desire. A city built on wealth that refused to call power by its real name: license. The trial that followed was unlike anything America had ever seen. It didn't take place in a courtroom, it took place on a stage. The press turned the killing of Stanford White into a national spectacle. The girl in the velvet swing. The architect of sin. The madman millionaire. They didn't need facts. They had Evelyn. When Harry Thaw walked into custody, he wasn't treated as a murderer, he was treated as a tragic hero. A man driven to violence by honor, jealousy, and the need to defend a woman's ruined purity. He didn't deny he shot White. He said he had to. His lawyers didn't argue innocence. They argued justification, that Thaw wasn't a criminal, but a moral avenger. They called it dementia Americana. An American kind of madness, violence committed in the name of protecting womanhood. Evelyn Nesbit was forced to the stand. A teenage victim forced to defend her own ruin, in front of the men who enjoyed watching it happen. She was coached to tell the story, but gently, tactfully, tragically. Not as assault, but as seduction. Not as trauma, but as corruption. The court wasn't there to hold Stanford White accountable. He was already dead. The trial existed to decide one question: was Harry Thaw a murderer, or merely a man defending what society claimed to value? The prosecutors called it revenge. The defense called it justice. The newspapers called it entertainment. The jury didn't know what to call it. Some saw a jealous husband. Some saw a patriarchy defending itself. Some saw a man doing what the law refused to: punish a man too powerful to touch in life. The first trial ended in deadlock. The second trial ended in a verdict that exposed the era for what it truly was. Harry Kendall Thaw, wealthy, violent, unstable, was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was sent to a sanatorium. Not a prison. Not a cell. A gilded cage for a gilded man. He was wealthy enough to be mad, but not poor enough to be criminal. And so the Gilded Age reached its natural conclusion. A teenage girl was destroyed. A powerful man remained untouchable until death. And another powerful man got away with murder. Not because he was innocent, but because the world agreed it would rather see a body on a rooftop than a mirror held to itself. When the trial ended, the city moved on, but no one who lived through it was ever the same. Stanford White was buried with honors, his legacy polished back into brilliance. Newspapers praised his architectural genius and sidestepped the velvet rooms, the teenage girls, the secret doors. Death restored his dignity. His sins were treated as footnotes. His buildings were treated as monuments. Harry Thaw left the asylum a free man. Wealth guaranteed it. Madness had been a convenient fiction, one he slipped off like a coat the moment the public stopped looking. He spent the rest of his life insisting he was a defender of womanhood, not a jealous killer. He never apologized. He never wavered. And he never stopped believing he was the hero of the story. But the real wound was carried by Evelyn Nesbit. She tried to rebuild a life, but the headlines followed her like a shadow. The girl in the velvet swing. White's child mistress. The woman men killed for. She was reduced to a symbol in a story written by men, first desired, then pitied, then discarded. She tried acting, modeling, even vaudeville. Everywhere she went, she was introduced not as Evelyn, but as evidence. The public consumed her tragedy, then grew bored of it. She married twice, divorced twice, watched her son die young, and spent her later years teaching art in a small town where no one asked about the velvet swing. She lived until 1967. Long enough to see the world pretend it was more civilized. Long enough to see Stanford White celebrated as a founding father of American architecture. Long enough to learn that survival is not the same thing as justice. The rooftop where White died was eventually demolished. Madison Square Garden was torn down, rebuilt, torn down again. New York paved over its memories and called it progress. But if you stand on Madison Square, just past midnight, and look up at the skyline he shaped, it's still there, the truth no verdict ever touched. Stanford White lived like beauty was entitlement. Harry Thaw killed like honor was violence. Evelyn Nesbit spent a lifetime trapped between them. The Gilded Age liked to pretend it was built on elegance. But in the end, it was built, like this story, on power, possession, and the silence of those who were never meant to speak. History tried to bury this story politely, the way society buries all its uncomfortable truths. But the rooftop murder of Stanford White was never just a scandal, it was a blueprint. The Gilded Age didn't die with White's body in that chair. It lived on, in privilege disguised as brilliance, in wealth reshaping the narrative, in men who never had to fear consequences because the world agreed they were too valuable to lose. Architecture students still study White's work. They run their hands across marble balustrades he designed, trace the lines of his arches, quote him with reverence. Few mention the hidden rooms, the swing, the girl, the silence that followed. They don't have to. His legacy was restored, curated, protected, the way only powerful men's stories ever are. The murder became a cautionary tale for the wrong audience. Not, this is what happens when power creates its own morality. But, this is what happens when private vice becomes public spectacle. That's the difference between guilt and embarrassment. One is punished. The other is erased. After the trial, Harry Thaw's family bought newspapers to shape public opinion. They sued anyone who tried to publish the full truth. They turned murder into honor, and honor into a shield. Meanwhile, Evelyn's face was printed on postcards, theater promos, scandal sheets, her body repurposed as currency once again. Everything she said was doubted. Everything White did was forgiven. Everything Thaw destroyed was justified. Because when a story threatens the structure of power, the story must be rewritten. And so the public forgot the lesson. They remembered the drama, the rooftop, the gun, the trial, the headlines, but not the truth, that this was never about madness, or revenge, or romance. It was about what happens when a society would rather worship the architecture of men than protect the innocence of girls. The names have faded. The chairs have changed. The parties moved elsewhere. But the blueprint remains. And that is why this story still matters. Because every era has its Stanford White. Every era has its Harry Thaw. And every era leaves someone like Evelyn Nesbit behind, to survive what the rich call history. By the time the century turned, the murder was already being retold as myth rather than warning. Broadway adapted it. Silent films dramatized it. Novelists romanticized it. The public loved the story, so long as it stayed a story. A tragic love triangle. A beautiful girl. A rooftop drenched in electric light. The truth was too stark to survive retelling. A powerful man used a child. A jealous husband killed him. And society applauded because the act preserved the illusion of morality. When America entered the modern era, it pretended to leave this scandal behind. But the pattern it revealed would repeat itself again and again. Brilliant men excused for predation. Wealthy men excused for violence. And the woman at the center forced to waste her life proving she was not the villain. Evelyn lived longer than both of the men who controlled her story. She outlived Stanford White by 61 years. She outlived Harry Thaw by 35. Yet history rarely names her first. She wasn't a muse. She wasn't a femme fatale. She wasn't a tragedy. She was a teenager used up by a system that told her beauty was both her power and her debt. In her final interviews, she spoke softly about forgiveness. But not the kind that redeems. The kind you learn just to survive the weight of being remembered for what was done to you, instead of who you were. They made me famous, she said, but they never let me become a person. The city has no plaque for her. The trial transcript is preserved, Stanford White's great buildings are preserved, Harry Thaw's money is preserved. But Evelyn's voice is a footnote in archives, a curiosity for historians, a face on a postcard sold for $4 on eBay. That's the real architecture of this story, the way power decides what gets to endure. The murder was loud. The truth was quiet. And in America, only one of those ever gets remembered. Today, Stanford White's legacy lives in stone. His Beaux-Arts monuments still shape Manhattan, the arch at Washington Square, the facade of the old Metropolitan Club, the carved ceilings once meant for men who believed beauty erased guilt. Tourists admire them without knowing the man behind the marble. That's how power survives, by letting its sins age into elegance. His name is carved into architecture textbooks, spoken with reverence in lecture halls, framed by chandeliers and symmetry. The velvet swing is gone. The apartment where Evelyn cried is gone. The rooftop where he died was demolished. But the myth was repaired. Harry Thaw left behind almost nothing. No legacy. No brilliance. Just a fortune that protected him long enough to rewrite what insanity meant. He died quietly. Without punishment. Without regret. Still believing that God and law agreed with his bullets. He was a man wealthy enough to confuse obsession with righteousness, and be believed. But Evelyn, she was the one who carried the ending. Not in blood. In silence. She lived long enough to watch the world become modern, without ever being allowed to be modern herself. She turned to painting. She taught. She tried to build a life that wasn't about them. But the newspapers kept calling her the girl in the velvet swing well into her 60s. They never let her grow older than 16. And that is the final truth this case leaves behind. A man can be powerful enough to escape judgment. A man can be wealthy enough to escape consequences. But a girl, even one who survives, is never allowed to escape the story. She becomes it. Even when she outlives it. The rooftop murder of Stanford White wasn't just a scandal. It was a blueprint. The kind America still follows. And still denies. That's why we tell the story now, not to relive the entertainment, but to recognize the architecture of privilege before we mistake it for beauty again. With time, the murder stopped being a crime and became a symbol, not of love, not of madness, but of the invisible machinery behind society's most admired men. Stanford White was the kind of figure America loves to protect. Brilliant, charming, refined, a man who built culture out of marble and gold. What he did in private was treated as an eccentricity, a flaw, something beneath discussion. Harry Thaw was the kind of man America loves to redeem. Rich, unstable, self-righteous, convinced his violence was moral. He claimed he was defending purity, and the courts let him. Because in that era, purity was something done to women, not something women possessed. And Evelyn Nesbit was the kind of woman America loves to forget. Young, beautiful, damaged by men the public admired, then blamed for attracting their attention in the first place. She entered history as a victim. She stayed in history as an object. That's the cycle. The city changed. The skyline rose higher. The Gilded Age died. But the pattern survived. Powerful men still exploit. Wealthy men still rewrite their motives. Women still get turned into symbols of what was done to them. Every time a scandal breaks and the world asks, why didn't she speak sooner? This story answers. Every time a wealthy predator is remembered for his brilliance instead of his brutality. This story answers. Every time violence is paraded as honor. This story answers. Look closely at a photograph of Stanford White. The beard, the posture, the confident eyes. A man who believed taste absolved him. Now look at Evelyn at 16, posed, costumed, sold as innocence incarnate. A child presented as a fantasy. The murder didn't end the story. It revealed it. Strip away the luxury, the marble, the velvet, and the truth was simple. The Gilded Age was not golden. It was gilded. Thin shimmering layers over rot. The kind of beauty that hides everything it builds itself on top of. And in that way, nothing has changed at all. In the decades that followed, the story settled into a strange kind of silence, not forgotten, but embalmed. It became a chapter in American history taught without tension. A curiosity. A footnote. A famous architect murdered by a jealous husband. A pretty girl caught between them. A scandal from a more dramatic age. That's how erasure works. Not by hiding the facts, but by dulling them. Filing them down until they no longer cut. Stanford White became a legend of American architecture, his name restored, his work preserved, his sins politely archived under personal indiscretions. Harry Thaw became a cautionary tale about unstable men with too much money, quickly replaced by newer names, newer headlines, newer tragedies. Evelyn Nesbit faded into still photographs and courtroom sketches, a face without a voice, famous for what she survived, not who she became. But the truth never really disappears. It waits in the margins. Look closely and it's still there, in the way newspapers describe fallen men as brilliant but flawed. In the way money is still allowed to define morality. In the way young women are asked to testify not just to what happened to them, but why they let it. Stanford White's death wasn't justice. Harry Thaw's acquittal wasn't madness. Evelyn's survival wasn't freedom. It was a map of who is allowed to hurt, who is allowed to kill, and who is not allowed to be believed. The case ended more than a century ago, but its structure still stands. A rich man with secrets. A rich man with a gun. A girl who never got to grow up before the world demanded an explanation. The names change. The blueprint never does. Stand on Madison Square today and there's no trace of the rooftop garden where the Gilded Age bled out under electric light. No plaque. No memorial. No warning. But if you look up, the skyline that Stanford White shaped is still there, elegant, towering, and full of stories that were never told in daylight. Buildings endure. Reputations endure. Power endures. But the girl at the center of it, the one who paid the highest price, was never allowed to. History remembers the architect. History remembers the gunman. History remembers the trial. But Evelyn Nesbit remains the most honest part of the story, the proof that beauty offered no protection, that truth offered no justice, and that survival offered no peace. The Gilded Age promised grace. What it delivered was a lesson. Behind every monument to genius, there is someone who wasn't allowed to speak. And behind every crime of passion, there is a crime of power. The rooftop murder of Stanford White wasn't just the scandal of its time. It was the moment America learned how to protect its idols and sacrifice its daughters. A blueprint. Still in use. Still followed. Still unfinished. And if you like this story, check out the ones on your screen. The dark algorithm thinks you'll enjoy these too.